Good afternoon, Goldman Sachs analysts. My associates and I are here today to convey you the advantages and disadvantages of conducting business in Singapore, as well as the aspects of the country which affect that. My name is Sina Mogadassi, and I'll be talking to you about the educational standard and curriculum in Singapore. My associate Joshua Gibbs will talk to you about the history of Singapore, followed by Jane Marone, who will talk to you about the geography and climate. Kaylee Marquez, who will talk to you about the culture. Charles Reneker will talk to you about the government. Alex Stugg will talk about the economy. And finally, Melissa Trevino will talk about the business environment. Now, as I mentioned, my name is Sina Mogadassi, and I'm here today to talk to you about education, the educational system in Singapore. According to a study conducted in late 2014 by the U.S. Department of Education and the National Institute of Literacy, 32 million adults in the U.S. can't read, roughly 14% of the population. The literacy rate of Singapore is 97%, meaning that in contrast to the U.S., in that study, of course, the U.S. conducted whether or not people could speak English as the first language, as to where in Singapore it was any language conducted. So there's a contrast there, but it still clearly represents that the literacy and adaptability of the people in Singapore have highly gone up and are currently leaders in the global environment. My next point is on the higher education in Singapore. In 2013, Singapore actually became the first Asian university to rank the top 10 in the Universitas 21, meaning that they've spent a lot of time and institutional money, research, and it also says something about their culture that they invest so much into their educational systems. Meanwhile, our wealthy city-states such as Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and Qatar have invested huge sums in lowering prestigious Western universities. They haven't had the same sort of success. So again, that clearly says something about the character and overall organization of the educational standard in Singapore. Finally, the academic rigor. In 2009, the Program for Student Assessment, PISA, did kind of like a global assessment on math, reading, and science, and they found that something that the U.S. led in 10 years ago is actually now led by Singapore. They have a clear distinction in their test scores, and the rigor which they place themselves through in this curriculum actually directly attributes to that. One of the reasons this is because in Singapore, the methodology they use is they have a strong family unit, which emphasizes academics and such, while in the U.S. we rely heavily on standardized testing and such to kind of judge rigor. In conclusion, I talked to you about the academic rigor of Singapore, the high literacy rate, as well as the higher post-secondary education investment. I'll now pass it off to my associate to talk about the history.
Hello, my name is Josh, and I'm a historian specializing in Eastern Asian studies. And today I'm going to talk to you about the early history, World War II, and the effect that independence and democratization has had on Singapore. So Singapore started off as Singapura, known as the Lion City. It was founded by Sir Stamford Raffles in 1819, who is connected to the East India Trade Company, and made Singapore associated with the Great Britain trade along the whole entire globe. Singapore's prime location has made it a very nice trade port and gave it prosperity when it signed the Anglo-Dutch Treaty in 1824, which gave it officially to Britain, along with Malaya, which eventually became Malaysia. So it grew in prosperity as a trade unit, and when the Suez Canal opened up in 1869 and the invention of steamships, there was even more growth in Singapore's revenue, and eventually it became the world's greatest trade port. In 1921, it gained enough traction to open its own naval base and was able to start functioning on its own. However, in World War II, the Japanese bombed Singapore on December 8th, 1941, giving it complete control under Japanese, and the British had suffered the largest surrender in its history, and when the Japanese started controlling it, they renamed it Sionyan To, which is the light of the South, South Light. And It only had Japanese rule for about a few years. When World War II ended, it got back into the Great British Military Administration. And by 1955, they had grown enough nationalism to gain its own election. And eventually, 4 years later, it had its own self-government. The British were pulling away from the Singapore government and decided that they would merge with Malaysia, who had just formed, and shortly they would actually leave Malaysia in 1965 to become its own republic, democratized, and it appointed its first president, Yusuf bin Ishak. So, in 1967, after gaining enough comfortability as its own republic, it joined Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, and Thailand to form the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And ever since the 1970s, it's gained political stability and a high rate of economic growth. And so today I've talked about the early history, the World War II, and how independence and democratization has affected Singapore. And now I will hand it off to my colleague.
Hi, my name is Jamie, and I'm a professor in business and economic geography, and I will be discussing the geography of Singapore, how the geography affects its climate and its central business district. So to begin, Singapore is located between Malaysia and Indonesia. It is one big island with 63 industrialized sub-islands called islets. So because it's one big island and 63 other small islands, its total area is 693 square kilometers. The big major island is composed of, or it's split up into 3 regions. The north central region is made up of a lot of hills. The southwest and west region has a lot of sedimentary rock, and the east region is also the lowest, and it's known for its sand composition. The coastline of Singapore is 193 kilometers. The sea level is 15 meters, and the Strait of Malacca is, as my partner Josh had mentioned, it's one of the areas for trade, and it is the shortest route between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. The climate of Singapore, so because of its location, it's categorized as tropical rainforest with a lot of rain. As you can see from the top graph, according to BBC Weather, the temperature maximum throughout the year will reach barely above 30 degrees Celsius, and at its lowest it will be in the mid-20s degrees Celsius. As you can also see from the same graph, there is not a lot of variation in the temperature and the climate. So there are no distinct seasons. You don't get fall, summer, winter, spring and summer like in other areas. As you can see in the second graph, it's showing the rainfall in Singapore in a year. And so there is a lot of rainfall, and mostly about 40% of the days throughout the year have thunderstorms, but that does not mean that there are a lot of impositions because of the weather. There are no chances of typhoons or earthquakes like other surrounding areas are prone to. One thing that firms and businesses should look for is that there are a lot of floods, especially in low areas because of the rain. And the central business district, so because it is one city-state, it's able to cluster all of the commercial and business areas into one. And so the central business district runs from north to south, and it has over 300,000 multi-international headquarter firms there. Since it's also the commercial area, it has a lot of shopping malls, entertainment districts. As you can see from the image, there's a Ferris wheel, and there's always attractions to do there. And at the base of the central business district is the seaport, and it is the busiest seaport in Asia. One comparison that is made, as you can see from the picture, is that it resembles its own city because it it's so busy and it's always lit. And in the background of the picture, you can see the rest of the Central Business District. So today I talked about the geography, the climate, and the Central Business District that investors and international firms should look for in Singapore. And now my partner will discuss the government. No, the
Culture.
culture.
Hi, my name is Kayla, and I'm an East Studies professor, or East Asian Studies professor at the National University of Singapore. I'll be going over culture, and in particular, its identification, demographics, and socialization of the area. So, as my colleague said, Singapore roughly translates to City of the Lion, and if you break it up, it's Singa-Pora, and that directly translates from Malayan to City of the Lion. The key traditions there are Malayan, Indian, Chinese, and Western influences. This also correlates with the majority of languages spoken there. So Malayan is the national language of Singapore, but English and various types of Indian and Mandarin are also widely spoken and taught in classes. Oh, that picture was supposed to be there. Okay, so there's a 6 million population, and its foreign worker workforce is around 300,000, and overall the ethnic population is fairly stable. So the lacking graph right here was supposed to show you that 76% are actually Chinese workers, and like I said, the ethnic population is stable. So the 76% is a 2015 study from a Cambridge research analysis that they did last year. And in 2013, it was at 74%. So from 76 to 74%, there is a fairly stable ethnic population. And major religions are Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, and various Christian denominations. So you can go ahead and see that Singapore in general is this melting pot of ethnicities, religions, and other, I guess, traditional aspects. So Buddhism is the majority of the religious aspects there, with over 40%, but then after that it's split up pretty evenly among seven other religions. So it's not one dominating religion, and it's kind of, like I said, this melting pot of understanding and whatnot. And then going on to symbolism, so Kiasu is this kind of like concept that's spoken around the country, similar to other nations that have slogans like Pura Vida and whatnot. So Kiasu directly translates from Malayan to high standard of living, roughly. And so this is kind of carried out throughout the education system, throughout a standard of living, and throughout home aspects, kind of always striving for the best in their families and they're in the workforce. So the flag meeting, so half of it is red and half of it is white, and that's supposed to symbolize unity and purity, along with the moon and the stars that symbolize democracy, peace, justice, progress, and equality. Lastly, I'll be going over socialization. And so according to the Cambridge study I referenced earlier, 80% of men are in the workforce and 50% of women are in the workforce. So that go ahead and numbers have been increasing generally when it comes to women, but they are still struggling with women in management positions, just like most nations are. And then 2% involuntary workforce. So they kind of pride themselves, again, going to the Kiasu slogan about high standards of living, and people who don't want to work, or people who do want to work, generally do find work with the expansion of businesses and other sorts. And then marriage. So marriage has been kind of a changing transition over the past years of what it used to be. So now polygamy is now legal, as well as multi-ethnic marriages are now more prominent. And I think this just goes to show that Singapore is transitioning, and it is kind of becoming, like I said, this like melting pot of other traditions and other ethnicities. And I think that's prominent in their marriages, and in their women steadily increasing throughout the workforce. So now I've talked about culture, and in particular its identification, the demographics, and socialization, and I'll pass it off to my associate who will talk about government.
Thank you. My name is Charles Reneker, and I'm a civics professor at the Singapore University, and I'm going to go over the history of the Singaporean government, the current government, as well as pertinent laws for doing business and just living in Singapore. So according to the government of Singapore, in 1963, Singapore left the Commonwealth of Britain and they joined Malaysia to be a part of their country. However, only 2 years later, they left over differences of opinion on how to go forward. And one of the things they did right afterward was they embarked on a massive program of modernization. They invested a ton in industry, they invested a ton in affordable and long-term housing, and they had also invested in education, as we've been talking about so much. And this is very important because it was a hugely successful program, and it led to this huge swelling of love and support for the government. And this makes a big difference in understanding how the current government is put together. So according to the Parliament, like the United States, Singapore runs on a three-branch system: the executive branch, the judicial branch, and the executive branch. They also have a series of checks and balances like the United States. However, they're not as active in using them. There's more governmental harmony, if you will. And like the United States, they make boards and they put together councils to deal with hot-button issues like education, things like atomic energy, things like regulating casinos. Unlike the United States, however, there's only been one party in power since 1959, even though there are elections every 5 years, and that party is the People's Action Party. So we talked about that love and upswelling, and every 5 years they get reelected because they're seen to be doing just an excellent job. The government of Singapore is seen as one of the most efficient in the world and seen as one of the least corrupt in the world. Of course, with one party in power, there are issues of election fraud and some shadiness going on, like in our country and a lot of countries. If one party is in power for a very long time, then they tend to use their influence to make it more difficult for their political opponents. And there are also issues that Singapore has with allowing free speech. However, as stated, the people love the government and it works